please join me in welcoming Ryan. Welcome, Ryan.
Thanks, Taylor, and thank you all for having me. I'm excited to be here to talk to you all today. I'm going to be presenting some work that I've been doing with my friend and co-author, Rosella Capella-Zielinski at Boston University. And what we're focused on in our project is battlefield coalitions, why they form, when they form, how they fight when they form, what they achieve, that sort of thing. Over the summer, we had the opportunity to write a couple of reports for some agencies within the federal government about what our research has uncovered so far. And that led us to think seriously about the topic that I'm going to be talking with you today about, which is the US's preference for how it wants to organize battlefield coalitions. So this talk actually comes at a really great time for us because we're developing these ideas. I'm excited to hear what you all think and directions you think might be useful for us to go. Okay. So, perhaps not working. Thanks. It's also not working. Sorry. There we go. Okay, there. All right. Clicker's working now. Great. All right. So, technology. As I told Taylor, every time I teach new technology in war, I always have these kinds of snafus and ask my students to tell me about the revolution. So what I'm going to talk about today grows, as I said, out of the project that I'm doing with Rosella. And what we're interested in are battlefield coalitions. And battlefield coalitions, as we define them, are amalgams of officers, soldiers, material that are brought together by multiple distinct actors that are used for the purposes of jointly waging combat in the same operational space. Right? So they might be constructed by alliance partners, they might be constructed by ad hoc wartime coalition members, but they're not synonymous with those larger political and strategic bubble groups. They operate at the operational and tactical level of warfighting. They can form, break down, reform many times over the course of the conflict. We're talking about the collectives that are at the pointy end of the military sphere. So we have lots of questions about battlefield coalitions. The two that we focus on broadly in the project are, under what conditions do these groups form, right? When and why do alliance partners, wartime coalition members take the next step of not just fighting the same adversary, but actually putting their forces together side by side in battle? And then second, when they do that, how do they perform? Are some battlefield coalitions more effective and efficient than others? If so, why? So I say all that as background to just give you an idea of where I'm coming from when I ask and talk about the question that I'm going to be focusing on today. So as I said, what I'm interested in speaking about is this question that arose over the summer: how well positioned is the United States to create and use battlefield coalitions that are likely to fight effectively and efficiently in a potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific? Right? So in terms of my larger project with Rosella, I'm largely setting aside that first question of why do these battlefield coalitions form, right? We're just going to stipulate that in some future conflict, a battlefield coalition or multiple coalitions would form. And so the question becomes, how does the US think about forming these, arranging, organizing these structures, and how likely are they to do what we intend them to do? So to provide a quick answer up front, we have a lot of concerns about the US's ability to actually form and fight through battlefield coalitions well in the Indo-Pacific. And we have concerns based on two reasons. One is that looking at newly collected historical data that I'll talk to you about in a minute, the kinds of battlefield coalitions that are most likely to form in the Indo-Pacific are among those through which the United States has tended to fight least well. Still won more often than not, but they've not been as efficient and as effective as the US has come to be accustomed to fighting in recent decades. And the second reason that we have concerns harkens to some organizational theory precepts. The US has a very distinct preference for fighting through hierarchic centralized command structures. And there are good reasons to think that those kinds of structures are going to be distinctly disadvantageous in the kinds of battlefield coalitions that are likely to form in the Indo-Pacific. So for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to unpack these 2 points. First, I'll talk about that data. And then I'll build on some work that Rosella and I have published about the relationship between battlefield coalition command structures, the member capacities, and combat performance to spin out the story that I want to tell. And then I'll end with a few implications that we're sort of walking our way towards and some next steps that we're taking that hopefully I can get your all's input on. So turning back to the first point that I want to discuss, to have a sense of how likely the U.S. is to be well-positioned to fight effectively and efficiently through battlefield coalitions in the Indo-Pacific, it's useful to have a baseline against which we could compare their performance, right? And until very recently, it wasn't possible to do this. Existing large-scale data sets didn't cover battlefield coalitions in the degree of granularity that we needed. So Rosella and I, despite being historically oriented qualitative scholars with limited quantitative skill sets, built a new battle level data set. And as you can see there, it covers 984 belligerent sides fighting in 492 battles waged in 62 wars since 1900. And these are the correlates of war identified interstate wars. Just to orient you to what's in the data set, I'll quickly run through this, and I'm happy to talk much more about our motivations, our processes, and codings later on. But just in terms of every single battle, we have onset and termination dates, the identities and the sovereignty status of the actors involved, the regime types of the actors involved, the total number of troops that were committed to the battle by each side, the number of casualties broadly defined, killed, wounded, captured, missing. The outcome of the battle defined in terms of which side achieved its operational objectives, and the location of the fighting, whether one side was fighting on its home territory or not, or if they were fighting on a third country's territory. When there are battlefield coalitions involved on one or both sides, we provide information on the size of the coalition involved, how many member countries were there, whether non-state actors provided forces that fought as part of the coalition, whether there were pre-existing defense agreements using Ashley Leeds ATOP data, whether any of the members had previously fought a major battle in an interstate war together, at least within the past 25 years. There's a little bit of familiarity. And then whether one of the members contributed only airstrikes to the fighting. So there's a lot that we can do with this data. A lot that lots of people who are more quantitatively skilled than we are can do with this data. And I'm happy to talk more about all of this later, but for our purposes today, just a few top line numbers will be useful to motivate our point. So looking at battlefield coalitions compared to solo belligerents in our data set, as you can see, about 25% of all of the belligerent sides in our data set were battlefield coalitions. And you can see that, especially compared to solo belligerents, they were more effective. They won more often, about 53% of the time, compared to about 46% of the time for solo belligerents. They did so while suffering an average casualty rate of about 21%, compared to about 25% for solo belligerents. And those differences between the performance of battlefield coalitions and solo belligerents are statistically significant. If we compare battlefield coalitions and solo belligerents on a couple more dimensions, we start to get some hints as to perhaps why battlefield coalitions have proven more effective. These are things that need further testing. First, battlefield coalitions tended to field more soldiers in any given battle. The way to think about this statistic is sum up all of the troops fighting on both sides in an individual battle. And then for every 100 of those troops, between 53 and 54 of them on average were fielded by battlefield coalitions. More often than not, they initiated battle and it's blocked here. But a little bit more than half the time, the battlefield coalitions fought on the territory of one of their member states, right? And so as we all know from reams of scholarship on the sources of military power, if you outnumber your adversary, you start the fighting, and you're fighting on physical and human terrain that you're familiar with, you're gonna have certain advantages, right? And so perhaps this helps us understand. So that's battlefield coalitions generally. What about that subset that involved the United States, where the US participated? Oh, I seem to have lost the clicker again. There we go. So the United States participated in 78 of those battlefield coalitions, 78 of 225. As you can see, the US, especially compared to the baseline of battlefield coalitions, has fought really, really well. Won 86% of its battles while suffering a little less than 17% in terms of its average casualty rate. You start to get a little bit less efficient and effective performance once you start breaking out different types of battlefield coalitions. So looking only at those battlefield coalitions that the US fought in, where there weren't at least 2 members that had previously signed a defense agreement, about 84% victory rate, almost 20% casualty rate. When the US fought as part of coalitions where at least 2 members had not in the past 25 years fought together, about 83% victory rate, almost a quarter in terms of the average casualty rate. And then when outnumbered, get under 80% victory rate, over 30% casualty rate, right? And just so fast forwarding a little bit to what I'm going to be talking about, thinking about the kinds of battlefield coalitions that the US is likely to form in the Indo-Pacific. We're probably going to see some battlefield coalitions where there aren't concluded mutual defense treaties, where the US is fighting with partners that it's not previously fought with. And it's not inconceivable to imagine the US-based battlefield coalitions fighting in an outnumbered fashion. So you might be wondering at this point whether these really spectacular numbers are conditioned to a certain degree by recent US experience where it's fighting considerably weaker adversaries. We had the same thought, and so we looked at a narrower slice of data, and particularly we looked at the period 1900 to 1952, so the turn of the 20th century to the end of the Korean War. And this is the period when the US is not yet the superpower that it would become in the latter half of the 20th century. And when it fights as part of a battlefield coalition, it's often fighting near peers or superior adversaries. So these are the kinds of fights that are more analogous to what we might expect to see in the Indo-Pacific. And as you can see, once we look at these, a lot of the numbers look a little bit worse. So of the 42 US involved battlefield coalitions in this period, fewer than 80% won with average casualty rate of a little over 18%. When there wasn't a mutual defense agreement, we're down to 70% effectiveness and about 19% efficiency. No experience, this seems to go well, but I think that this is really driven by the US jumping in later to wars in the first part of the 20th century. And then well outnumbered, we're talking only about, winning 2/3 of the time and almost 30% casualties. So just to be clear, these are still good numbers, right? The US is still winning more often than it's losing. But the point to take away, which is sort of the foundation of our concern, is that these kinds of fights that the US has been involved in with battlefield coalitions are the kinds where it's performed least well, right? So the US, in a potential conflict in the Indo-Pacific, when it forms a battlefield coalition, it's likely to fight with partners in the kinds of collectives where it hasn't performed up to its most recent standard. Okay. So, given that sort of disparity, or the difference, or the decline, perhaps, is the best way to talk about it in terms of the effectiveness and efficiency of American-led battlefield coalitions. We'd expect political and military elites to spend a good amount of time thinking about how to maximize the effectiveness and efficiency of the groups that they form. And one way to do that is to make sure that they're organized such that we're maximizing the comparative advantages of our partners, minimizing weaknesses, that sort of thing, right? And so for that reason, I'm going to turn to talk about, oh no, I've lost the batteries. Technology. Turn to talk about organization theory, right? And the way in which, organizations talk about, or the way the US prefers to organize its battlefield coalitions. So the first point to note, before I dive into how the US actually prefers to fight, just some basic stipulations that I don't think are controversial and are pretty well established in the study of battlefield coalitions and organization theory generally. The first is that battlefield coalitions are formed by rational actors of varying capability who at minimum want to defeat a combined adversary, but want to minimize their own individual costs as they do so. The second point that I would stipulate is along the lines of basically all organization theory since 1925. There's no single best way to organize when you've got rational actors of varying capabilities and similar but not identical interests. And then the third point that I would stipulate is holding all else equal. The better organized that collectives are to maximize their comparative advantages, minimize their weaknesses, the more likely it is that they're going to perform effectively and efficiently. Right? And so together, all of this implies that any battlefield coalition, it's going to be difficult to organize. But it's going to be really important that the organizers think about the capabilities, the weaknesses, the interests, and the goals of the different partners as they try to bring everyone together to fight as a coherent collective. And so if we look at how the US thinks about forming battlefield coalitions, Joint Publication 316, Multinational Operations. It's the core official statement of how the US likes to fight in these kinds of situations. You can see here that the US seems to get all of these points, right? That it's important to take account of the interests and the capabilities of your partners, going so far as to say there's no standard template to these types of organizations, right? And there's a good amount of time spent in the doctrinal publications talking about the importance of understanding your partners, building good rapport with them, being patient during the coordination process, and maintaining a laser focus on how to maximize the capabilities of each partner as you go through all of this. And so to this end, organization theorists would applaud what we see here. These formal statements, at least at the beginning of JP 316, seem really good. But if we dig deeper into these doctrinal publications, we start to see a little bit more reason for concern. And that reason for concern starts in the extreme emphasis that JP 316 and many other American doctrinal publications put on this concept of unity of command. So looking at JP 316 specifically, it says, quote, participating nations should strive to achieve unity of command for the operations to the maximum extent possible, with missions, tasks, responsibilities, and authorities clearly defined and understood by all participants. Now, this is just one place where the importance of unity of command is highlighted. And this is significant because unity of command has a very distinct meaning. Going to JP 3-0, unity of command is defined as, quote, the operation of all forces under a single responsible commander who has the requisite authority to direct and employ those forces in the pursuit of a common purpose. Right. So that quote that I showed you on the last slide notwithstanding, there is underlying all of this doctrinal thought, this idea that what we really want is a single commander who is maximally empowered to direct and command forces. Right. And if we keep going through these publications, we see the different ways that the US thinks about organizing battlefield coalitions. The first of three ways that's talked about is referred to as an integrated command structure. And this kind of command structure features a single empowered commander serviced by a staff that is populated by members of all of the contributing forces. And then you've got integrated commands and staffs as far down to the lowest echelon possible. Right? In terms of authority, the commander has operational command or OPCOM, and usually operational control or OPCON. And then he or she has the authority to designate or delegate tactical command, TACCOM, tactical control, TACCON, down to subordinate commanders. And so what this means in practice is that the commander of a battlefield, an integrated command structure battlefield coalition, has the authority to assign missions, to deploy units, to reassign forces, and then direct those forces in combat at the operational level, and then delegate that same set of assignment and command authorities down to lower levels at his or her discretion. American doctrine is clear that this is really only functional in the context of a well-integrated alliance structure where the partners have had a long time to institutionalize various rationalized, standardized processes, procedures, et cetera, right? So integrated command structure, highly hierarchic, highly centralized, highly unified in terms of command. The second type of command structure that the US envisions, it refers to as the lead nation command structure. And this involves the establishment of a single military as the dominant actor with a single commander at the top, and each of the contributing forces retaining their own national integrity at lower levels in the command structure. The commander's staff might be integrated with multiple members from the various contributing forces, may not. In terms of control, the lead nation commander has OPCOM and usually OPCON, but TACOM and TACON are usually retained within the national structures that are lower in the lead nation structure. This kind of structure is envisioned for alliances that have not yet had time to figure out how to fight through an integrated command structure, or ad hoc wartime coalitions that may or may not have fought together, but are sort of figuring out how to organize on the fly. The third type of command structure that the US envisioned, it refers to as parallel command structures. And these are distinct insofar as there's no single designated overall commander. OPCOM, OPCON, TACOM, TACON are all retained by the national armies. And the commanders of those national armies form a coordination center in which they negotiate their different aims and plans and intentions. And then ideally, the commanders of each of the national forces that retain OPCOM, et cetera, issue those orders on the basis of some sort of consensus agreement, right? And this is the kind of command structure that's envisioned for ad hoc wartime coalitions where one or more of the partners has serious reservations or concerns about subordinating their forces to the command of another. So these are, of course, ideal types, and there are lots of variations on them, and you can mix and match them. You might imagine a situation where you've got a lead nation command structure governing the activities of, say, 3 members, and then a 4th member is connected through a parallel command structure. The precise number and variety of these different types isn't really important for my purposes. What matters is the rank order that the U.S. ascribes to each of these command structures. So if given the option, the U.S. really wants to fight through an integrated command structure, right? And from the perspective of a country that uses unity of command as its North Star in thinking about multinational warfighting, this makes sense. And we can see this preference through the intense amount of energy and effort that's been put into developing integrated command structures. So NATO, right? The NATO Combined Fighting Doctrine, the Allied Joint Fighting Doctrine for the Conduct of Operations, AJP3. It says, quote, at the operational level of war, emphasis should be placed on integrating the contributing nations' forces and the synergy that can be attained. The success of the process will determine the ability of a joint force to achieve its objectives. So said differently, the failure to successfully achieve this integrated command structure is likely to undermine the performance of the NATO battlefield coalitions, right? An integrated command structure is also functionally what we see with the US and South Korea, though there is some very slow movement to shift operational control to the South Koreans. When integrated command structures aren't possible, the US has a very strong preference for lead nation command structures. So for example, the Multinational Interoperability Council, which is comprised of the US, Canada, several Western European states, and Australia. A subgroup of NATO with Australia involved. The procedures that they have laid out for how battlefield coalitions are to be formed by their members explicitly endorses the use of the lead nation concept, right? When we fight together at the operational and tactical level, this is how we're going to fight. This preference for lead nation command structures extends beyond the US's interactions with its traditional Western partners. So to this end, the Multinational Planning Augmentation Team, MPAT, is instructive. MPAT is an entity that is headquartered in the Indo-Pacific headquarters in Hawaii. And MPAT is a self-described Asia-Pacific capacity building program, where it brings together civilian and military personnel to form personal and professional relationships, to get to know one another's doctrines, their TTPs, et cetera, and to figure out how they can jointly work together to effectively organize at the operational level in crises other than war, right? So it's a huge group and includes China. But the standard operating procedures that MPAT has developed for multinational forces, again, explicitly endorses the lead nation concept. And the group that is part of that comprises MPAT seems to be so enthusiastic about this lead nation concept that there's no other command structure that's meaningfully considered in these 1,300 pages of SOPs. So compare this really strong and invested effort in integrated and lead nation command structures, which really adhere to this unity of command idea, to how the US talks about parallel command structures. So going back to JP 316, they say parallel command structures are to, quote, be avoided if at all possible. Digging a little bit deeper, if American commanders are forced to operate through a parallel command structure, doctrine says you've got to form these multinational coordination centers. Great. So what does that mean? It means bringing together all sorts of liaisons and figuring out how to coordinate, reach consensus. The discussion of how to actually do this is pretty limited in JP 316. But if you dig into the footnotes, what JP 316 says is to understand how to build these coordination centers, go look at the MPAT SOPs, which, as I just told you, MPAT assumes a lead nation concept, right? So to the extent that the US thinks about parallel command structures, it discourages them and then tells users or readers to go look at another set of guidance that really disregards the idea of parallel command structures. So in many ways, we shouldn't really be surprised that the US has this really strong preference for unity of command and lead nation command structures in particular, because they're a product of a military that, despite its professed adherence to the ideas of mission command and decentralization, is really a centralized micromanaged force, right? And this is a point that's been well established through lots of historical work by York Muth and others, and occasionally breaks into public debate, as it did in 2005 when a British brigadier by the name of Nigel Alwyn Foster published a piece in the Military Review where he excoriated the Americans in Iraq for operating in a really micromanaged, centralized way. So often, culture and doctrine are in two different places. Doctrine's something that's on the shelves. This is the case where culture and doctrine really fit together well, right? The US has this preference for centralized, unified command, and that extends to how it thinks about fighting with its partners. So if we lived in a world where hierarchic centralized systems were likely to serve well, in most or all cases, this wouldn't necessarily be a problem. But as I mentioned a few minutes ago, organization theorists and many who study these kinds of issues just that's not how the world works, right? And instead, what we need to think about is how do we organize to make sure that we are as effective and efficient as possible when coordinating these actions. And to do that, organizational structures need to do three things. They need to reduce the three types of drag that reduce the effectiveness and efficiency of combined operations. First is transaction costs, which is the expenditure of time, energy, resources that could otherwise be allocated to dealing with the primary objective of the group. The second is shirking, which is the actions of some subset of the group that are actively working against the achievement of the collective goals of the group. And the third is free riding, which is sort of the passive effort of some members to avoid contributing to the prosecution of collective group goals, right? And depending on the particular makeup of a battlefield coalition in question, hierarchic centralized command structures like a lead nation command structure may exacerbate or alleviate those three kinds of drag. So there are lots of different ways we could talk about the composition of these different groups. I'm going to talk quickly about four. The first is thinking about the willingness of members of a battlefield coalition to subordinate themselves to a lead nation type concept, right? This is a situation that American doctrine explicitly considers, right, as I mentioned. But in this sort of situation, actually establishing and maintaining a hierarchic centralized command structure over less than willing partners is going to increase transaction costs. It's going to incentivize shirking. It's going to incentivize free riding. So rather than ameliorating those three types of drags on collective performance, it's actually going to make them worse, right? And set them as additional challenges beyond what the adversary sets for the battlefield coalition. So holding all else equal, we'd expect the utility of hierarchic centralized command structures to fall as resistance to subordination rises. A second dimension along which we can think about battlefield coalitions is in the number and variety of caveats that home governments put on their forces that are part of these battlefield coalitions, right? You can think about this in terms of rules of engagement, right? So there may be some members of the battlefield coalition that have relatively few limitations on their rules of engagement. There may be others that have lots or at least different limitations, right, on what they can do in combat. And the argument that Rosella and I want to make, and I'll be interested, especially on this issue for your all's thoughts, is that it seems to us that transaction costs would go up as the number and variety of rules of engagement caveats increase, right? It seems like it would be harder, more difficult, more complicated to coordinate the efforts of the different battlefield coalition partners as they differ more significantly in terms of what they can do, right? I'm thinking about shirking and free riding. To the extent that a battlefield coalition commander asks participating members to do something that their home government hasn't authorized, it could incentivize shirking and free riding. So again, holding all else equal. At the moment, and again, I'm interested in your thoughts, we'd expect that the utility of hierarchic centralized command structures is likely to fall as the number and variety of member forces restrictions increase. A third dimension along which we can think about battlefield coalitions is the asymmetry of resource distributions among the battlefield coalition members. And this is something that Rosella and I have published on. And the argument that we make in that piece is that the closer battlefield coalitions get to what Mansur Olson calls privileged groups, where you've got one really powerful actor and lots of smaller actors, the easier and more effective it is to use a hierarchic centralized command structure. When you've got one really powerful actor, that powerful actor can absorb increased transaction costs. It's easier for that actor to detect and monitor any attempts at shirking or free riding, or to disregard them if the partners are small enough, right? And so our argument that we published is that as resource asymmetry increases, more hierarchic, more centralized command structures are going to be more useful. And then the last last way that I want to talk about distinguishing battlefield coalitions is in terms of their interoperability. Right? And when I talk about interoperability, I'm using the term in the way that most scholars and practitioners think about it. And I just mean the ability of systems, units, and forces to provide services and receive services from other systems, units, and forces. Right? So increased interoperability, whether it's at the doctrinal level in terms of processes, information management, weapons systems capabilities, right? The more interoperable forces are, the lower transaction costs are going to be. Right? There's just less that you have to try to coordinate when everyone is singing from the same page in the hymnal. At the same time, more interoperability doesn't necessarily disincentivize shirking and free riding, but it makes it easier to detect it. Because if everyone is supposed to be doing and capable of doing the same thing, if someone doesn't do it, it's much more obvious and easier to figure out. So holding all else equal, we expect that the feasibility and utility of a hierarchic centralized command structure will increase as battlefield coalition member interoperability increases. So stepping back out and drawing these points together and thinking about the kinds of actors that the United States is likely to either choose to fight with or be forced to fight alongside in a potential war in the Indo-Pacific. There's some reason for concern, right? Because there is no sort of Asian-Pacific NATO that has spent decades in terms of coordinating doctrinal publications, training, interoperability, and all that other stuff, we're likely to see a lot more variation in terms of the willingness of different battlefield coalition members to subordinate themselves to lead nation command structures, at least in combat operations, right? It's different than what MPAT talks about with operations other than war. We're likely to see more variable restrictions on rules of engagement just because countries have developed different ways of fighting. They have not been sort of synchronized in the way that NATO has attempted to do for several decades. We're also just likely to see, with a few exceptions like South Korea and Australia, lower levels of interoperability between the US and potential partners. And all of those three factors all point towards the idea that a less hierarchic, a less centralized command structure something more like a parallel command structure is more likely to reduce transaction costs, reduce incentives for shirking, reduce incentives for free riding. The only variable that I've talked about that will push towards lead nation command structure, likely, is resource asymmetry. And there we would just expect that the U.S.'s provision of a large amount of resources, perhaps very important specialized resources, would make it that sort of privileged actor that would push us towards a more lead nation type command structure. So when I talked about all of these variables, I was careful to say, holding all else equal. And we know in the event of fighting, not all else is going to be equal. How do all of these different variables fit together? I don't know. This is a point that Rosella and I are at in terms of how we're thinking about this project. And as I'll mention at the end, it's one of the top items on our to-do list as we move forward. Thinking about how these different variables interact and whether one might dominate or two might dominate the other. But what we're left with at this point is at least some really serious reservations about the idea that a lead nation command structure is absolutely going to be the best way to go about trying to organize battlefield coalitions in a future war in the Indo-Pacific. So where do we go from here? As I discussed, the U.S. preference for a lead nation type command structure in battlefield coalitions is deeply rooted in its institutional processes, in its military culture. And trying to make changes to either of those things is really hard. Trying to do both is, getting up there towards impossible. But there are some suggestions about ways that we could think about moving forward. First point is to just recognize the problem, right? Looking at U.S. doctrine about how to fight with partners at the operational and tactical level. The first couple pages, they say all the right things, right? But then when you dig deeper, it gets a little bit dicier, right? And just recognizing that at this juncture, and then adding in the fact that, looking back at our data, the kinds of battlefield coalitions that the U.S. is most likely to fight through in the Indo-Pacific are those in which it has fought least well. This is a problem. So recognizing the problem is the first step, and hopefully Rosella and I have made that point compellingly. And then once you recognize the problem, instead about trying to fix it, you can think about sort of two tracks here. The first is a political track, right? Think seriously and coherently about what exactly American objectives are in the region and what that implies about when force is likely to be used and who is likely to be fighting alongside the United States. Now, this is certainly not going to be easy. Certainly, there are people here who disagree about what American political objectives should be in the Indo-Pacific. But coming to some sort of conclusion on that point is an essential first step. And then, being good Clausewitzians, we need to shift the military so that it's better in line with U.S. political objectives. And so what this means is revising, to the extent necessary, doctrinal publications and making the requisite changes to professional military education curricula, right? Doing those sorts of things. And recognizing on the basis of scholarship by Barry, by Harvey, by Steve Rosen and others, that bureaucratic processes are significant inhibitors to how we think about fighting future wars, right? Make necessary adjustments to promotion patterns, evaluations, and things like that, so that the folks who are more inclined to take non-lead nation command structures seriously are more likely to be elevated to the positions that they would need to be to affect the kind of change that would be needed. So then, just to wrap up, as I said at the beginning, this is really a work in progress, and Rosella and I are interested in your thoughts on where we are and where we should go. There's a ton of work to be done, but there are three things that we're thinking about carefully here. The first is what I mentioned a few minutes ago, is how do we think about the relative weighting of the different pressures that push some towards parallel command structures, some towards lead nation command structures. How do they interact, and how should we think about it more holistically? Second, the Belligerence and Battlefield data set that I briefly talked about at the beginning, it focuses on land battles, right? And the way that we've been thinking about battlefield coalition operations, it kind of assumes a land battle type set of operations. any sort of future conflict in the Indo-Pacific may have some land operations, but it's going to be conducted largely at sea and in the air. And so next up on our to-do list is digging more deeply into naval and aerial operations and thinking about what command looks like in more detail in those domains, and whether that necessitates any changes to the kind of framework that we've started to lay out here. And then finally, our research, again, you've been able to hear in my presentation, is focused almost exclusively on American and a little bit NATO doctrine for thinking about battlefield coalition organization. We want to spend a lot more time digging into how potential partners in the Indo-Pacific have been thinking about training for and practicing fighting partners. So I'm interested in your questions and comments on all of these points. I really appreciate your attention, and I look forward to any thoughts that you have.
Great, fine. Thanks. All right, so we're going to turn to the Q&A. First order of business, anyone from MIT on the Zoom, we now have the technology to enable you to ask your question live. So if you want to get in on the queue, raise your hand in the Zoom and I will call on you. Otherwise, everyone else in the room, just raise your hands as high as you possibly can. Eric Lynn Greenberg, you had the first question. Everyone else, keep them high until I look at you. So I just need to get.
Right. Thanks so much for the talk. I guess I have two questions. One deals with maybe alternate or complementary explanations, and the second, excuse me, is just a point of things to maybe ponder down the road. And I guess in terms of complementary explanations, are there factors that lead to the selection or choice of a certain type of coalition structure that have an independent effect on combat effectiveness, right? So put differently, are these confounders? Are there confounders that are being caught up in this, right? So I can imagine, in some cases, the same factors that might lead to an ineffective combat operation might also lead to the choice of parallel, coalition structures, just because of the nature of those militaries themselves. And then the point about kind of food for thought down the road, I think your third next step was thinking about coalition training and operations. I wonder in the data set that you're putting together, whether there's another way to capture experience, right? So as opposed to just pure experiences of joint warfighting, whether you can add another experience category for whether or not there have been integrated joint exercises.
Right, thanks. So on your first point, I absolutely think that there are all sorts of interactions here. And I mean, doing social science, we have to abstract away a lot. I spend a lot of time thinking about individual nations, command structures. And so trying to aggregate up, I take it as a point that we need to think more seriously about it. Our goal right now is just to try to figure out the framework so that we know what questions to ask, right? And that's really part of the reason that we put together the data set to get to your second question. Joint exercises, it's a great idea. We've looked into it. It's been really hard to find data that we are super comfortable with in terms of accurately capturing all of those sort of interactions. So the battlefield experience, I've talked about it as just having fought together in the last 25 years or not. The variable itself is more graduated. So either you've not fought together in the past 25 years, you've fought together in some previous interstate war, you fought one battle together in this war, or you fought 3 or more battles together in this war. So there is some graduation there, but once you start digging into it, it gets really hard to find any sort of statistically significant relationships. I take the point. We've spent a lot of time trying to think about how to operationalize familiarity, and I think this is the best we've come up with. The exercises is a great idea, but to the extent we found useful data, it really limits the subset of actors that we'd be looking at. Thanks so much.
Great. Suzanne Freeman.
Hi, thank you so much for a really interesting talk. I have 2 short questions, also kind of like Eric. My first is, how do adversaries respond to this preference for the lead nation command structure? I think that's not exactly what you're trying to address, but something you could. And if I think about sort of the way that it seems like Russia's responded to sort of the lead nation command structure within NATO, although you label it as integrated command structure, is that it seems to sort of think about US equals NATO, NATO equals US. It's an instrument of US policy. And second, how much do things like trust impact the preferences for different command structures? Since command structures will depend on sort of how different types of information, like classified military intelligence, are shared.
Hey, absolutely. Thank you for your question. So first, on your first question, I take your points. I don't have much in the way of the research that we've done that can speak to that. So anything I would say would just be sort of inference from my general knowledge. But I think that your point about sort of the identification of these more hierarchic unified command structures with the United States in the minds of the adversary is an important one. At least insofar as potential conflicts are discussed and talked about and envisioned in the international realm. And to the extent that you think that talking about future conflicts as multilateral efforts against joint adversaries is important, that would be sort of a negative externality of those. On your second point, yes, trust absolutely matters. And that's where when you start digging into what the individual battlefield coalition command structures looks like, you start to get a lot of the really mixed up combinations of some integrated looking elements, some lead nation looking elements, some parallel looking elements. And so, I mean, thinking about like AUKUS, right? The focus has been on submarines, but there's also been agreements about sharing more information intelligence as part of it. And so absolutely, that's really important. But AUKUS is also sort of a warning indicator for the kind of argument that Roselle and I are making, where the US and Australia are really close. We fought together in every war since World War II. And we're just now getting to the point of sharing some of these really significant pieces of intelligence and information streams. Thinking about combining with forces from India, from Philippines, from Thailand, wherever, that's going to complicate and increase transaction costs incredibly if you don't have that trust.
So I'm going to be bold and call on someone from the Zoom. So Josh Shiprinson, if you're there with us, over to you.
Great. Can everyone hear my disembodied voice?
Yes.
Oh, great. Ryan, I appreciate that you didn't bring the cap this time. So two questions. First, I wonder if, just impressionistically, some of America's own battlefield experience sort of contradicts your own argument, right? Which is, even within hierarchical command structures such as that we had in the Second World War, allies still shirk, they still try to deviate, they still try to buck pass as much as possible, and this occurs even when the command structure varies. So I guess what I'm asking getting at is it possible, and this maybe echoes Eric's question, whether instead of org theory being the driver, this is really a story about national interests and states just kind of doing as states are going to do to get what they want on the battlefield, independent of the command structure that is selected. And I guess I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thanks, Josh. Andrew, would it be possible to hold this up and go to the very last slide? Sure. Which one? The very last one at the end of the slide deck. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Right. So that's fine. So Josh, this is a good question. It's one that I think I acknowledge the importance of, but we're going to try to define our way out of in certain ways by thinking about why it is we think that battlefield coalitions form in the first place. And our current thinking is that it's, good social science is a 2x2, an interaction of the desire to fight together and the ability to fight together. And so thinking, and again, remember, we're talking about these coalitions fighting in individual discrete battles. How much do they actually want to fight together in this particular battle, right? How does that align with their joint war aims, right? There's always some deviation there. And then what are the stakes of the coming battle for the group to actually achieve those war aims? And then sort of logistics, can they actually fight together or can they not? And so in terms of thinking about national interest, I think a lot of that is going to be captured in sort of the first step that I didn't spend much time talking about today. But in terms of your narrower question, thinking about American experience in World War II with allies shirking, free riding, et cetera, absolutely, that's going to happen no matter the command structure. And the question becomes, how relatively common is that sort of behavior? And if a command structure is arranged in such a way that it's making demands on partners that they either don't want to make or can't make, then you are incentivizing those kinds of unfortunate behaviors. And so you can't always get rid of them. People are people, and especially in war when bullets are flying, there are strong incentives to shirk and free ride. But if you can minimize those incentives through command structures, that's how we're thinking about this project.
Next, Victoria Henley, right over to you.
So first, thank you for the talk. I wanted to echo Eric's point. So I was recently an exercise planner in Europe. I think NATO exercises. I think the diversity of task organization there is probably greater than you would give credit to. I think the task organizations that are used in exercises in the Indo-Pacific, and I know we do exercises there annually, would be very relevant to your discussion of what we prefer, because as you acknowledged, military doctrine and what actually happens are often not even similar. The other thing I was gonna sort of ask about was your relationship between interoperability and the utility of hierarchy. And particularly on this, I would ask about the echelon of cooperation. So maybe below the division level, I would offer that increasing interoperability does not necessarily increase hierarchy, and actually it's the reverse, because there's little trust or communication when you're not interoperable. So you want to be as integrated as possible to know what the other guy is doing. And I think that's what certainly, sort of anecdotally I've seen. And I think that though that trend would reverse sort of above that level. So at some point when the two units are not interacting on the ground, then parallel becomes much more practicable because we're not as worried about fratricide. And just put that to you as some thoughts.
No, I appreciate that. And just on your last point, I completely agree. Unless I'm misunderstanding, I'm not sure that we're saying something different. Maybe I wasn't clear. My point was that as interoperability increases, it becomes easier and it's less difficult to impose hierarchic centralized command structures. And that's slightly different than whether or not they will be imposed, am I misunderstanding what you were saying?
I think I'm saying that it's less preferred. So like the lower we have interoperability, the more we would prefer to have a hierarchical command structure that has clear control. Because there's not the trust that the other one is going to do what the coordination cell is saying it's doing.
Okay. No, that's very helpful. I mean, you have experience, I don't. This is, as I said, this is a project that's very much a work in progress, and we're still thinking through how we think all of these relationships fit together. So maybe we can chat for a minute after we're done.
Absolutely.
Great.
Chuck, was that a two-finger on this?
I'm going to make it a two-finger.
So make it, all right. I like it.
So, yeah, I'll just say to pile onto that so it can be a legitimate two-finger. But the question, I guess there's 2 points here that I would ask. In determining what data sets you were using, it seems like you were disparate in keeping things from a larger perspective, meaning there's a battle, which is part of a campaign, which is part of an operation, which is part of a war. If you're isolating those as an independent variable, as it were, I don't think it gives credence to draw the analysis correctly by saying that the command structure in one specific area is effective or not, because they're part of a larger approach campaign. And particularly with the longitudinal time frame, you really look at the United States from a post-World War II era when we came into the modern structure that we are using and building upon today. So things before that maybe aren't necessarily as good of a theater to be a comparison. And then the point moving on to the last comment here, I think the natural tendency to go from a preferred integrated to a lead as a secondary comes down to the basic tenets and principles of unity of command for the synchronization of efforts, providing unified action. And much like, to use a very common term, if we're playing a football game, we've got special teams, we've got an offense, we've got a defense, but they don't run the independent actions for the game. There's a head coach that has to have an overarching game plan that can support controlling and coordinating those efforts. And it's not an effective use of resources, which is where I guess the question would be to you if it was looked at from that capacity. When you've got multiple entities with each levels of competing interests without a unified structure that can pull those resources together. And particularly, I think from the United States' position, when you look at it globally, particularly across the areas of the world that you just mentioned, there's no other country that has the warfighting capacity by functions that we do when it comes to STRATCOM, logistics, intelligence, command and control, resourcing those. So I don't know if I would submit to you that I don't think that it's even plausible to have an effective parallel command structure in today's environment.
Okay, so I want to talk about your last point first. Everything you said aligns with how I sort of read American military publications. The problem that I think exists is an assumption that unity of command and unity of action are necessarily connected. It's certainly a plausible argument, but I don't think it's a necessary relationship. Because you can think about all sorts of, like moving outside the military realm, but even staying within the military realm, you can think of lots of different ways of decentralizing authority where you're still making sure that everyone is fighting towards the same end. And to the extent that there has been this long-term bias towards unity of command, this hierarchic centralized structure, just by virtue of how organizations and learning work, there's been less effort put into thinking about how to do things like parallel command well. I'm not sure that I'm not sure that the struggles that are experienced in attempting parallel command are indicative of a necessary relationship between parallel command and unity of action. It may be, but it doesn't seem like it's logically necessary. But I take your point. Sort of thinking about this moving forward, we do need to talk more about sort of how we're thinking about unity of command versus unity of action. And on your other point about sort of longitudinal effects, we agree. I should have had a fourth bullet point on things that we're going to be thinking about next, and thinking about how command structures develop over the course of the conflict. So the data set doesn't actually provide any information on command structures. It's hard enough trying to get reliable numbers on troops deployed and casualties suffered. The idea that we could get reliable information on battlefield coalition command structures in like the Third Central American War, it's not something that, given an army of RAs with lots of language skills and infinite time, I could do it, but it's not something we can do. And so the data was more just to sort of set the stage. But as I said, Rosella and I are both historically oriented qualitative scholars. And so thinking about the book project that's eventually going to encompass a lot of this, one of the things that we do want to think seriously about is the development over time. And you've got folks like Sarah Mahler, who was here a couple of years ago, who makes an argument about failure pushing towards unity of command over time, which is a plausible argument. It's just one that we disagree with as sort of a necessary way to improve battlefield coalition effectiveness over time.
Julie, this is a two-finger from your one finger?
My one finger is a two-finger.
Excellent. Then over to you, Julie.
So basically, just to kind of go back to Victoria's point, I wonder when you talk about interoperability, whether a more kind of fruitful thing to think about would be the degree of specialization Because I can see with interoperability, depending on how specialized the role of each coalition member's forces are to the overall effort, I can see an argument for different command styles, right? So if everyone is buying the same stuff, but let's say, especially since we're talking about Indo-Pac, right? Everyone is buying missile destroyers and they all have, kind of one goal that they're all going to contribute to. That's a different kind of force with a different kind of command structure that might be useful than if everyone is buying American weapons, but one country is specializing in ASW, one country is specializing in reconnaissance, right? So I think maybe when you talk about interoperability, what you're really meaning there, or maybe this is something that needs to be considered in conjunction with the level of interoperability, is what is the actual role of each force within the coalition? And are they contributing in the same ways, or are they pursuing specialized roles?
I think that makes perfect sense. It's not something we've done yet, but it's absolutely something that we'll pursue. Thank you. What was your name?
Julia.
Thank you.
Another two finger?
It's just Andres Gannon, who just defended his dissertation at UCSD, has a dissertation on specialization and its effects on alliances. Yeah. Sorry.
We'll call that the three finger point of information. Thank you. Next, Maria Gunberg, over to you.
Thank you. So I guess a comment and a question. So I'll start with the comment. I was a little surprised, given how you laid out the problem, that you had a linear relationship between how your four different factors affected whether or not a hierarchical relationship and command structure would be a good or bad idea, or how to influence them, because you have three different variables across which they could vary. And a lot of times they didn't necessarily all point in the same direction. But sort of to pile on to the complication that imposes, the rules of engagement question, it seems to me that hierarchy could plausibly actually make that easier to settle if the people in command know that this particular unit is only allowed to be doing action X, therefore we will only assign action X to them. There will be no questions about who's allowed to do what, which will actually possibly solve the shirking problem as well. And the other one on the military interoperability plausibly could make free riding easier, because if more than one actor can provide the same service, people would plausibly attempt to blockbuster or free ride on whoever else can do the same thing. But then that was the comment. On the question side, a lot of the problems that you described in the Indo-Pacific area that could lead to conflict between how the United States wants to run a coalition versus how it might have to run a coalition, wouldn't all of those factors describe the situation in Europe before NATO? So before a big threat forced them to create interoperability, create NATO, create a way to fight together. So why would a high level of threat not solve the same problem in the Indo-Pacific area?
Great. So let's take the question first. Can you say just a bit more? Why would a high level of threat not solve the problem? What does solve the problem mean?
In the sense of assuming that we're trying to increase our efficiency at fighting in coalitions, create a situation where there is less mistrust, more willingness to subordinate command, and sort of across your list of factors, make it easier for states to fight together and increase their performance.
I see. Right. So the answer that I would give is partially theoretical and partially sort of idiosyncratic. The theoretical argument is that these militaries aren't coming to one another in a tabula rasa situation, right? They each have their distinct preferences and their historical experiences working together. And so thinking about the idiosyncratic element, I mean, the U.S. has these very distinct preferences, whether or not they fit, right? As you know, there's the conventional sort of quip about when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. When you have a battlefield coalition, everything looks like human nature, effectively, to the U.S. And that may be the best way to organize, at least in some battlefield coalitions. The point that we're trying to get across is that there are a series of imaginable scenarios in which that might actually create more problems. And so I don't think I was clear enough. Like the sort of ideal end state that Rosella and I would push towards is organizational flexibility. So figure out when lead nation structures are appropriate, use them then. Figure out when they're going to be problematic, don't use them. Because why are you going to take on more risk, create more problems, organizationally speaking, than you have to? And so that's going to require figuring out how to fight better through these parallel command structures. On your comments, I think, again, I must not have been clear enough. We don't think that there's a linear relationship between those four pressures. Our one published piece focuses on the resource asymmetry, and I think that's really important. I think that often that's probably going to swamp the other types of considerations, but it's not always going to. And then thinking about cases in which the US and battlefield coalition partners are more symmetric in terms of the resources that they're bringing to the fight, we still need to figure out how to think about how these pressures push towards organizational outcomes in those types of scenarios. The points about hierarchy and our ROE problem and interoperability, these are arguments that Rosella and I have been having for months, trying to figure out how we think that these relationships fit together. Whether we end up with the arrows exactly as I've shown you, once we settle, I don't know. But the points that you made are certainly good ones, and align at least in part with some of the arguments that Rosella has been trying to convince me of.
So you have been pursuing a parallel command structure, Maria.
Yeah.
Let's see. Next up, Raymond Wong. Raymond, how are you?
Hi, thanks for a great presentation. I'm Raymond, third year in the program. This is more a clarification question. So is the argument you're making one about the optimal organizational form? So is the argument you're making is that given conditions in Indo-Pac, the parallel command structure is the optimal structure, but U.S. organizational culture will mean it will try to get a lead command structure, therefore it's so it will pursue a suboptimal structure? Or is it an argument saying that lead nation or integrated forms are the optimal type of structure, but given Indo-Pac conditions, the U.S. can only pursue a parallel organizational structure, i.e. parallel organizational structure is a second best structure? Or are you just agnostic about sort of optimality in terms of these different structures?
Right. So personally, I'm agnostic, right? So in my book, I rely heavily on contingency theory, which is a subset of organization theory that just says the appropriateness of any particular organizational structure really depends on the context in which it's used. As I was just saying to Maria, I can imagine battlefield coalitions in which, in the Indo-Pacific, that lead nation structures would be great. But I can also imagine battlefield coalitions in which they would cause significant problems in a parallel command structure, assuming that we solve this unity of action issue, right, would be more likely to facilitate effective and efficient behavior by reducing transaction costs, reducing incentives to free ride, et cetera. And so that agnosticism, it pushes me and us towards this idea that U.S. needs to be a lot more flexible in how it thinks about these organizational command structures. Not that one is necessarily best or anything like that, but don't try to fit a square peg into a round hole just because you really like the square peg.
Mina Pullman.
Thank you very much. I think this actually might go well with the last couple questions, but I find your framing about when. I wonder if it's more framing about who to do it with, like which are the partners or the allies that we want this command structure model with, and which are the partners and allies that we want this other model with. Because I think you mentioned at the beginning that there are three ideal types, but hybrids do exist, and I wonder if like a hybrid is kind of the direction that you're thinking in. And so the question is that you mentioned the Indo-Pacific region, there's variation in the willingness to subordinate and the restrictions on the rules of engagement. I was wondering if in practice you see those things going together, the two variables that you have regional variation. Do you find that there are generally states that are more willing to subordinate and have less restrictions, and then do those things tend to go together? And if so, is there actually like a subset of states that are well suited for a lead nation command, and then maybe the other states are less well suited, and you would want to approach it with parallel. So kind of would like to think about, we're thinking like a hybrid approach to the region, and whether which states, it might be more about which command is better for, rather than like when which command is better.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. And I think perhaps I've just not been as clear as I need to be with my language. On that 2x2 and, when do they fight together? That really encompasses, who, when, under what conditions, right? Because thinking about World War II, the Brits and the Americans are making choices about whether to fight together or fight separately on the Western Front, right? And a lot of that depends on what London thinks is really important, and what's a high stakes operation versus what Washington does, and then also how they can fit together, whether Patton can make his turn and get there in time, that sort of question, right? And so that encompasses a lot, right? So this should just be understood as like, under what conditions do we see battlefield coalitions form? And so the who is a big part of it. And so on your point about the willingness to subordinate ROEs potentially going together, I suspect that there is a good amount of covariation there, but I wouldn't expect it to be perfect. Because you can imagine, and we saw it in like Afghanistan, where you've got different European countries that are willing to go and subordinate as part of ISAF, depending on who's the lead nation at that point in time. It's not necessarily the US, but they each have different rules of engagement, right? And so would I expect there to be a lot of correlation? Absolutely. I don't think it would be perfect. Whether that discrepancy is enough to separate them out into two separate pressures to think about, I don't know. This is a work in progress. This is really helpful to hear how you all are reacting to it, because to date, it's been Roselle and I bouncing these ideas back and forth and getting these additional perspectives. Super helpful.
If you have a two-finger on this question.
Yeah, thanks. I have a two-finger that adds both to what Raymond and Mina had asked. My name's Nick. I'm a third year with SSP. You had mentioned explicitly that you're not making a normative judgment about whether hierarchical or parallel structures are better, but admittedly, hierarchy does a lot of work in your theory, and it interacts with all four of the IVs that you mentioned. And so my question is, just going from your descriptive statistics, which focus mostly on the experiences of the US, have you found evidence that other great powers with non-hierarchical structures tend to perform better in battlefield effectiveness in conditions that might be, say, similar to what we're experiencing in the Indo-Pac? And the reason I ask is it seems to me that there might be a bit of a selection effect in which I can't think of a great power that would prefer not to have a hierarchical control structure, and that they probably select into coalition forming precisely because they believe that they can control other partners and prevent them from going off the rails. And so I was wondering if maybe that could be a false assumption, and that there are cases in which parallel structures, pursued by other states could be more effective. But I couldn't imagine, say, the PLA, subordinating any degree of command to North Korea, right, in the event of an Indo-Pac conflict. And then very quickly to tag on to Mina's point, one of your variables is willingness to contribute. And if I understand, you would frame that as a structural variable, but I'm wondering whether status also has some kind of role in a state's willingness to subordinate its forces. And I'm thinking, the obvious example might be France and NATO, but for Japan, an example in East Asia, there was this feeling that they had missed out on an opportunity to participate in the first Gulf War, and that the SDF had its own reasons for not militarizing. But then when Afghanistan and Iraq came around, they were suddenly very much on board, not because there was just an immediate security concern, but there had been a sense that they had missed the bus. And so do you think that those kind of ideational factors also matter? Not to add another IV to your otherwise very clear framework. Yeah.
So on the last point, does status matter? Almost certainly, but probably not as much as we might expect. Because when we're talking about battlefield coalitions, we're talking about the forces that are actually fighting side by side in combat. And so, yes, Japan did contribute to 2003, but it was medical ships, if I remember correctly, right? So they wouldn't actually be, they wouldn't fall into what Roselle and I are interested in. And so thinking about why conditions under which belligerents decide to deploy their forces side by side in battle, I think status probably operates more at sort of the political strategic level than the operational battle level. I'm sure there are examples that some of you can think of that, we really need to fight this particular battle because it will redound to our national honor if we do, and we'll look foolish if we don't. I'm not sure that practically that happens that often. I mean, in terms of the great powers with the non-hierarchic structures, that's not something that we've been able to code for in the data. My intuition is similar to yours, that great powers like to control things. And so perhaps the US's inclination towards a lead nation command structure is not abnormal in that context. But sort of taking that as given, the question becomes, okay, so the US preference to operate through a lead nation structure, even if it's not the best structure, is perfectly fine when you're dealing with Iraq in 2003 or Kosovo or something like that, right? It gets a little bit more dicey to knowingly take on additional risk and challenges and introduce friction. If that is sort of what happens when you're fighting a near-peer competitor, right? And so why saddle yourself with challenges that you don't need to have? But then back to your point, right? How do we weigh? Because there are distinct advantages to hierarchy, right? You can do a lot in terms of information management, harmonizing efforts, and things like that. How do you weigh the advantages of hierarchy versus, in some situations, the increased transaction costs, the shirking, the free riding, et cetera? There's a lot of moving parts.
Thank you.
We're going to move to the speed dating portion of the Q&A. So I'm going to group two questions. First group will be Rich Nielsen and Aidan Millett from the Zoom, and then I'll turn it back to you, and then I'll go back to the next group. So Rich.
Hi, Rich Nielsen, associate professor here at MIT. How long would it take to know if changes to doctrine or organizational structure that you're advocating were working, right? Would it be something we can tell? And what data would you look for? Something we can tell quickly? Do we have to have a hot fight before we can tell? Would progress be linear or would it be non-linear because changing an organizational structure is different than imposing one from scratch? Curious about your thoughts on like practical implementation, if there was broad reception for ideas.
Great, thanks. Aidan, you're still here.
Yes, hi from the internet. I'm Aidan, I'm a 6th year in the PhD program at MIT. Apologies if I missed this at the start, my connection was cutting in and out, but it sounds like you were looking for ways to measure this kind of battlefield cooperation that's broader than just participation in actual battles. And I was wondering if you had thought to include some of like the US's foundational agreements, things that are definitely going to increase interoperability when they're signed, but are obviously far short of fighting together. And then just in terms of time trends, seems like a great idea to look at change over time. One thing I was curious about is, do you think that these different structures, especially parallel command, are equally plausible or feasible over the entire 100 years of the data set, just from like a technology perspective?
Thanks, Aidan.
Great. So first, in terms of how to know if the changes are happening, again, how long it will take, I think it's going to take a long time. Changing any, U.S. military is a massive organization, and trying to change the way it thinks about doing anything is often a fool's errand, right? And so that's why the way that we've been thinking about this sort of top down, we need some clear political direction, but then sort of diving into the lower level and thinking about who's writing the doctrine, who is, promoted into the kinds of places where they would actually be doing the work of figuring out how to organize these battlefield coalitions, changing PME curricula. It's going to take a long time. How would we know if it changes? Absent some sort of conflict, in a situation in which a more parallel structure would be useful and the U.S. actually implements it, I'm not sure, given sort of the long period of time that the U.S. has really dedicated itself to this lead nation idea, it would be possible to know if changes have actually been implemented. In terms of your questions, the U.S.'s foundational agreements, so in the data set, we code for whether at least 2 members of the battlefield coalition have signed a mutual defense treaty. There are lots of different sorts of agreements and treaties. We selected specifically a mutual defense treaty because we thought that that was the best for proxying the idea that there would at least be some pre-war coordination and attempted institutionalization of procedures and approaches. Whether that happens or not is a different story, thinking about like Germany and Austria-Hungary before World War I. Right? They had their alliance, but due to personality conflicts and sort of a superiority complex in Berlin, you don't have a whole lot of institutionalization of coherent procedures for how to fight together. But that was our effort to try and get at that as close as we can. And looking at change over time and thinking about technology, I think my best sort of sense is that it is easier now to implement a hierarchical centralized command structure, given the sophistication of technologies available. But that's separate from the effectiveness of that kind of structure. And I mean, we've all spent 2 decades thinking and hearing about commanders back in air-conditioned offices looking at the battlefield through a soda straw and a drone, right? So in terms of actual implementation, I think it's easier today than it was in the past, but that's not necessarily correlated with effectiveness.
Great. So our last pair, Wright and Apiksha, short, sharp questions, and then turn it back to you. Right?
Hi, Wright Smith, third year. I might have missed this at the beginning, so I apologize if you covered it, but is the preference and sort of the effectiveness of any given coalition, is it independent of what kind of war is being fought, whether it's a much more limited, restrained conflict versus a total war of some kind? And does the U.S. desire to control escalation play into its preference as well?
Right, Apiksha.
I'm Apiksha, I'm a 5th year grad student. Thank you for your talk. My question is about your prescription regarding having a military that is flexible under multiple kinds of command structures. So I hear that we need to retain some of the institutional knowledge and inertia that we already have, but we also need to create a military that can switch when we want to. So then in practice, like how do you see that happening in terms of education, personnel, joint exercises with allies? Like, do we need to purge a part of the military and have a new force come in? Do we educate them separately? Like, what does that look like?
Final word, John.
So first, unlimited total war, that's not something that we've thought about, but it's something that I've marked down that we definitely need to spend some more time pondering. And your last point about controlling escalation is an important one, especially thinking about a U.S. conflict in the Indo-Pacific. So thank you. I appreciate that. I don't have a good answer at the moment. I don't want to just spin something. In terms of putting this flexibility into practice, I know in general, I'm not a fan of the idea of creating separate tracks, just because you're sort of separating out individuals, and in the event of a war, it's not like, oh, okay, we're going A team for this battle, B team for that battle. If I were put in charge of PME, I would need to know an awful lot more about it first. But my general thrust would be to increase sort of sensitivity to the idea of parallel command and spend more time training and practicing on how to operate under those, from an American perspective, non-ideal conditions, so that when and if it's necessary, you can do it as well as you can. I don't have a more specific answer for your question. It's a great one. It's just not something that I'm equipped to answer at this point.
So right on time. Thanks for a wonderful talk, Ryan. Thanks for coming all the way to visit us. And everyone, please join me in thanking Ryan.